Hello, and I'm here at the Fondation Brochet with Dr. Ciara Staunton, independent researcher who has worked across institutions and universities in the UK, Ireland, Italy and South Africa. Ciara, welcome.
Thank you, great to be here.
So I understand you're interested in the governance of new and emerging technologies. Can you talk to me about how you came to be doing this work?
I think it started in school really when we started started studying biology in second level. I was always quite interested in science. I was a very curious person, and I always remember when we started looking at genetics. I think when I was in the senior cycle of school, and I really enjoyed that work. But when it came to deciding what to do in college, it was a decision between genetics and law. And for personal reasons, I decided to go to the university where I could study law. And throughout my legal studies, I studied for 3 years as an undergraduate and then 1 year as a master's. I was always still quite interested in science and thinking through, I suppose it's very rational science, and law is a very rational discipline as well. And after my master's, I took a year out, got into student politics, and then returned back to the law. And I got a job for the Law Reform Commission in Ireland. Many countries have such a body, and they essentially are part of the government but independent. And what they do is they look at difficult or challenging and sometimes really boring areas of law that need to be reviewed and reformed. And mine was all about end-of-life care. Care of the elderly in home care, but also advanced care directives, what we often know as living wills. And when I was coming towards the end of that work, I knew I wanted to stay in research. I was really interested in research, so PhD was sort of like a natural avenue for me. But I spent so much time looking at the end of life. I wanted to kind of shift my focus towards the beginning of life. That in between at the time wasn't really interesting me that much. And at the time there was a constitutional ban on abortion in Ireland. But what they did is they didn't actually say in the constitution abortion is outlawed. What they did is they stated that the unborn has equal right to the life of that of the mother. And so that has a lot of implications for assisted fertilization, because the unborn, is that just when the fetus, or is it an embryo that is created outside of the womb? And that's the way we have assisted reproduction. And I was quite interested in assisted reproduction, but I found that that wasn't challenging enough, because the aim of assisted reproduction is to produce a child. I wanted to look at, well, what if our aim is to use that embryo and destroy it for research purposes, such as embryonic stem cell research. So that is what I decided to do my PhD on. I had a really good time, interesting PhD, but I found that my enjoyment in talking about the law was when I was talking about it with scientists. I wasn't so much interested in the philosophy of the law. I wanted to talk to scientists who said, we want to do research on that. Here's the problems that we're facing, and here's how we think there are solutions, and kind of working with them to create a framework for governance in which embryonic stem cell research can be used for good, for real purposes that's of benefit to the population. And that is where the interest in research and cells came from. And then from that, during my PhD, when I was editing it, I spent some time in the WHO. I interned there, and I was in this very fortunate position to be finishing early with funding left over. So I secured a fellowship to go and spend 3 months in South Africa. And the idea was I'd continue my work on stem cell research, but I was kind of just a bit fed up after spending 3 years intensively looking at that. So we agreed to do something on biobanking, because a lot of stem cells are housed in a biobank. And so that biobank essentially, it's like a large freezer of cells and tissues in which you just pop them in, and they're there and available, subject to ethical and legal requirements for use for research. And so we developed a paper it was the first paper actually that looked at challenges with biobank governance in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. And while I was only meant to stay there for 3 months, I stayed for over 3 years. And from there on in, I just exclusively have looked at biobanks, genetics, health data, and kind of all of the legal and ethical issues in both the African context and also the European context.
That's fascinating. What are some of the specific legal and ethical issues associated with biobanks and emerging technologies in the global south as opposed to Western contexts where these issues are often discussed?
A lot of the issues are the same. But there are some differences. For example, when you think of the legal and ethical issues in the Western context, we think about informed consent, stigmatization, discrimination. Similar down in sub-Saharan Africa, which is where most of my research look at. But there's also, which I never knew of, the cultural significance that a sample may have. And that is not an issue which actually would arise in other populations. For example, some African cultures, they want to be buried whole. And if there's a bit of them that's here, there's issues with them, the ancestors might not be happy and, will they go into the afterlife? And we need access to their samples because we need their data. Because if we want therapies to apply to everyone, we need to do research on every single population. So for example, if we're only doing research on Caucasian populations, that doesn't mean that the therapies that are produced is going to work for an Indian population, an African population, or other populations across the world. So we need to navigate and address and consider and listen to these communities' concerns and explain to them why we want to access to the sample and how can we get access to the sample in a way that is culturally appropriate. I think over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a real movement from Indigenous communities across the world. So I'm not just talking about in sub-Saharan Africa, but the Maoris, the Aborigines, the First Nations in Canada. There's a real strength and power, and their voices really come through. And in addition to seeing, principles from the scientists of what we need, or global governance principles coming from the WHO, Indigenous communities have come up and say, if you want access to our samples and data, here are our rules. So here are the rules of engagement if you want to get access to our data and samples. And I think that's something that's really important and something significant that has come through in the past 10 years, I would say.
So I understand you've done a lot of work with a specific biobank in northern Italy, and a lot of that has been kind of grassroots community work. Can you talk to me a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So we have a biobank called the CRIS study in South Tyrol, and there's 13,500 participants from one particular valley, and we actually have samples from 50% of that particular population. The study's been going on about 11 years, and there's a lot of very innovative work that has gone on. One of the things which, and now I should say I've only been involved with them for the past 5 years, but one of the things that was really driving the governance framework was this, the voice of the community really came through, and they've been consulted throughout the entire process, at the beginning, before the samples has been collected, in developing the policies to govern the biobank. And what's incredible is that they've created this platform in which there is this two-way communication between the study and also the research participants. So when we reuse their data for a particular research study, we inform them about this. They have their own app or website where they can access, get information about that. And of course, it's been going on over 11 years. Technology and science really is moving quite rapidly. So there's a lot of new studies that we can actually do or things that we want to do that we didn't know when we originally collected their samples and data. And this tool allows us to go back and speak to them, ask them for the permission. And I think that is very innovative because there's a real move generally in science towards patient-centric approach and getting away from this, okay, we want your samples and data, we are taking them and here's our rules, we're setting this up. But this shift towards a more participant-centric approach means that you should be listening to them and having this two-way dialogue, that recognizing that participants are very meaningful and important entities in the whole research process. We hear about pharma, we hear about academia, we hear about government's involvement. But at the end of the day, research wouldn't happen without the participants. So it's important that they have a benefit to their participation in this whole process.
I was going to say, there are examples from the history of research in human subjects of exploitation of those populations. And I think one of the challenges, it seems to me, with biobanking is, the fact that often the people whose samples are being used don't receive direct benefits.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond being informed about the consequences of research, are there any benefits that flow to this population from their samples?
Well, I think we should just make it very clear that, like, you know, the purpose of research is not to benefit the individual, and we always make it clear that if you're participating in research, it's for the benefit of the population or the general. It's a public good, shall we say. Whereas if you want personal benefit, that is clinical care, and these are two different enterprises. But that is not to say that there shouldn't be some benefit. And if you are doing research on a population, you must make sure that they can access the resulting therapies and drugs. And we often hear stories of the past, the early days of the HIV pandemic, where research was happening on populations in sub-Saharan Africa. But once the clinical trial was over, they didn't have access to drugs. But these aren't cases of times gone past. We also saw it in the COVID pandemic. There were clinical trials in sites across the world, but the access was quite delayed to many of these populations. So it's incredibly important that if there's research on a population, they should get access to that resulting therapies. But there is also other benefits which can accrue. For example, you can make sure that we do science cafes in the past. So you're telling the population, educating them on or empowering them on the particular area of the research, and they're more knowledgeable about science generally. Others, there's quite innovative approaches to actually what is known as benefit sharing in research. So this idea that we're going to go into a population, we're going to ask this access to samples and their data for research. And there is more of a dialogue about, okay, well, what benefit is going to come to the community in addition to the general research studies. And there is one pharmaceutical company which has a benefit sharing pledge. So it's called BioVariant. And they have to, the exact details of the pledge escapes me right now, but they have a certain percentage of revenue will actually go back to the population for community projects, and it's unrelated to the research. They may decide that they're going to use it to build a well or to buy notebooks and pencils for schools, but it's quite interesting, and it's very forward thinking, and it really is acknowledging that without the participants we would not be here, and also to acknowledge the historical exploitation and discrimination in which research has historically taken place.
Fascinating. So just to take a step back, when we're talking about the governance of research and technologies, we're talking about the rules essentially that decide how these samples are accessed. Do you think that the rules we have at the national and international level are fit for purpose, or are some of the rapid changes in technology putting pressure on those rules and calling for a fundamental reconsideration? Yeah,
there has been an evolution in how, not so much in the rules, but how we apply the rules.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, over the past 10 years. So if we take informed consent, historically, research is taken in the context of one study, one informed consent. So I will be participating and I agree to this clinical trial. I'm in it for that purpose only. And you're doing research on me, on my physical body, which has a lot of risks. Physical risks, depending on what stage you are, it could turn out that the intervention is toxic and I get quite sick from it. And we know then that intervention doesn't work. But with the emergence of biobanks and genetic research, what there is more move towards is that you get a biological sample, which could be your skin, it could be your blood sample, it could be another piece of your tissue. And from there, they will get your genetic data, which is kind of like the building blocks of who you are. You get 50% of your genetic data from your mom and 50% from your dad. And that kind of is like the recipe for who you are effectively. But when it comes to getting that, you need consent to get it. But the question is, do I need to have consent to reuse that data? And the data can be reused, and the biological sample can be reused for different research studies multiple times at no extra physical risk to the individual, because sample has already been gone. So they're not going to come back and ask me for more samples. So to my body, there is actually no extra physical risk. And so the question is, well, do we need consent? Because informed consent, the principles are, it is voluntary, it's informed, so I need to have information about the research study, and it must be specific. And we had always interpreted that as specific to that particular research study. But then considerations were, well, there's no extra physical risk. Can we reuse it? Is it actually, if we say I want to reuse it for research generally, is that specific? And so what emerged maybe about 10 years ago is this notion of broad consent, which is you're broadly consenting to various types of research without having to whoever's using the data to go back and ask you. So we've seen kind of a development and a rethinking in what is consent and how it may apply in the different contexts. The questions of whether or not it's fit for purpose, it's more of a challenging question because the rules differ across many countries. What we do know is the importance of international collaborative research. We want to get as much samples and data from as many populations as possible. But the challenge is this sharing of data outside the borders. Many people have concerns, and rightly have concerns, about sharing data. Because if you're sharing genetic data, it contains the building blocks of who you are. That is personal to you. You know, your data is very different to my data. And you can tell a lot about a person from having that information. And so it really interacts with your right to privacy, which in many countries across the world is constitutionally protected. It's actually stated in your constitution that you have a right to privacy. And we all know there's been a huge development of data protection regulations. It started with the GDPR in Europe, which I think everybody is, once they're in Europe, they know about it. But similarly in countries across the world, they have data protection regulations. And while this is incredibly important, because it protects our personal data and makes sure that our personal data is only used in a specific way which protects our personal data, it does limit and put restrictions on sharing of the data. And so it can be quite complex to share data across borders, which does limit how we may collaborate moving forward. And for me, that is something that I think we need to, as an international community, we are trying to address these issues. But we need to acknowledge that while there is a need to share the data and the samples, there are these national legislations in place. And also there are the social and cultural considerations. Some people just don't want to share the data, and we need to respect that and acknowledge that.
It seems to me what you're suggesting is there's an importance to respect norms of privacy, right to privacy. There's an importance to respect cultural specificity. But at the same time, if we don't allow for open access to data, we risk entrenching structural inequalities in healthcare research, which focus unduly on privileged white Westerners.
Yeah, so I'd say yes with one caveat. I would never advocate for open access to data, because open access means that there's unrestricted use, and that's problematic. These are individual level data, contains a lot of information, because usually it's not just your genetic data shared, but your other health data. Because to really understand your genetic impact on diseases and so forth, you need this other health data. So I would say we should have restricted, controlled access, but we should be premised on we will share the data if these conditions are met. But I think what's important for me is that there is a need to protect this personal data, because there's risks if we share the data, risk to privacy. There's also risk of discrimination, which is a concern. But there's risk if we don't share the data. So if en masse we say, I'm Irish, we're not going to share the data outside of Ireland, then that means that a lot of therapies are being produced may not be suitable to the Irish population. We don't know, because it hasn't been tested on. So when we talk about risks, the risks in sharing, but we need to balance it against the risk with not sharing. So I think what's important for us when we are developing rules and governance frameworks, we don't be too restrictive and too overprotective. Because if we're too overprotective, we may not get benefit to our local population. So it's how you try to balancing this. And this is why I would advocate for a controlled access model. That is rules of engagement. The people have said, this is what we want, here is what's important for us, and developing rules that enable this data sharing while protecting.
How is the rise of artificial intelligence affecting this field?
I think it's affecting it in a number of ways. The benefit is that AI can help us analyse large quantities of data. And there's huge amounts of data being produced for genetic data that humans simply cannot process. And so AI has actually been in the genetics world for quite some time because we do need it. What is increasingly is people are academics and also citizens that we talk with who are focusing on is how the problems or the issues associated with using this data to train AI models. And it's interesting that, I was recently given a lecture in the University of KwaZulu-Natal to law students on enabling access to genetic and health data to train AI. And the students themselves, well-educated students, they were in the final year of law school, they all had concerns with AI. And they said, we don't like the idea of our data being used to train AI. And this is something that we are hearing time and time again, that there is this concern, and often it's a gut reaction. People say, I just uncomfortable. And when I tried to probe it with the students, they just said, I'm just uncomfortable with it because I don't know what the AI is doing. But again, if we do, as we move towards medical AI and having, medical AI in the hospitals and clinics and so forth, we do also need to remember that at the moment, we are only training the AI on data that we have. And the data we have is primarily Caucasian populations. And so that means that the medical AI, the diagnostic tools that are being developed are really only reliable on Caucasian populations. And if we want to, and that means we're going to have this inequity between, the global north and global south, for example, or inequity in different populations is going to increase because we're only having these new tools and technologies that are going to be of benefit to certain populations. So while we acknowledge the concerns that people have with regard to using their data to train medical AI, I think we as a scientific community, as academics, as the healthcare system, have a duty to have a dialogue with participants, with patients, and why and the importance and need to get access to that data. And when having this conversation, I think that, explaining the benefit and the importance of it for them, their family, their community, and their children, it also needs to show here is how we are governing it appropriately. So again, it's in some ways, it's the same conversation we're having. It's just a new technology. So the conversations and the issues we were having or concerns with genetic data sharing, it's just reconsidered in the light of AI. And so there isn't massively new issues. The only thing is this new technology in which we're not really sure where it's going.
And in terms of the next chapter for you as a researcher, what gives you cause for optimism and what concerns you?
I think the optimism for me as a researcher is that there is increasingly, I see, an acknowledgement of the importance of international data sharing and setting standards and creating an environment in which we do enable a data sharing. The concern, so it's not so much a concern, but we are seeing a rise in what's known as data sovereignty, and that governments or different countries, they want to hold on to their data. And while you can really appreciate and understand the need to do that, the problem is putting up borders on the data. And when there's borders put up, reduces collaboration, and it reduces the number of people who can access the data. And I've already mentioned why we need to get access. But if you have borders up in your data, the pool of expertise who can use that data is actually much smaller. But I think what is good is that there's an acknowledgement of the importance of looking at these concerns, addressing these concerns, and trying to think about how can we move forward together for the benefit for all.
Ciara, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.